Hi there. I'm doing some Q&As in which members of the website, you guys submit questions, and Kate, my trusty PA, will collate them and put them on a sheet to me, and I'll choose some of the good questions in my view to answer. And so this is one of those questions, and I'm going to try and give my response to it. So this is a question from Edward. Thanks very much for sending it in. It's an excellent question. Edward says, one of my favorite paintings is Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, and I often look at it in the National Gallery. I've often wondered whether the pose of the two apostles refers to the crucifixion, arms outspread, and the resurrection, lifting oneself from one's chair, as well as the clear astonishment of what is being revealed. Am I reading too much into this? Well, let's have a look at the picture in question. I'm just going to share my screen. So here we are, Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus. Now, I think this is a great question, because thinking about it, I don't think it had occurred to me. I'll have to reread my book to see if I've mentioned it, but I think it's a wonderful idea. When I was writing about the painting, which is painted at what I think of as the high noon moment of Caravaggio's career, it's this sort of masterpiece just at the moment when he's arrived properly on the Roman scene and is being recognized as one of the most fascinating, vigorous, original painters of his generation. He's full of confidence. He's painting for noble patrons, and he's at the peak of his powers. And he's also very militant. Caravaggio's an artist who has no time for the conventions that will become fixed in Baroque painting, whereby when a miracle is depicted, it's accompanied by hordes of cherubim, or the hand of God, or an angel flying down from heaven. These sort of massively obvious signals of miracle. In Caravaggio's world, a miracle is only there for those who have eyes to see it. In other words, God presents a miracle to you, should he choose to do so, within the appearance of normal reality, and it's up to you to recognize that it is a miracle. And that, in a sense, is almost the subject of this painting as much as it is the miracle, because this is a painting about those who see the miracle and those who don't see what is being revealed. The story is Christ at the Supper at Emmaus. Now, the biblical tale tells us that Christ, after his crucifixion, after the resurrection, comes back to earth essentially in disguise. He doesn't look as he had looked before. And I think this is why Caravaggio has painted Christ here, not in the traditional Christian or not in the traditional Western Christian sense. He's not painted him as the bearded Christ figure that we see elsewhere in Caravaggio's work. He's painted him more as a kind of version of the beardless Apollo/Christ figure that appears in very early Byzantine art, obviously done within a naturalistic mode, so he looks like a real person. But this mysterious figure meets two pilgrims who were his followers in life. He meets them on the road, and he goes with them to an inn. They don't know who he is. They sit down to eat a meal with him, and at the moment when they're about to eat, he blesses the bread. He blesses the bread. And they suddenly realize that here he is. This is the living Christ there before them. And one of these two followers begins to raise himself from his chair. The other stretches his arms out. We are meant to think of them as parallels to ourselves, in the sense that people looking at this picture would, in Caravaggio's time, have gone on pilgrimage. And this is alluded to in the fact that the figure on the right with the outstretched arms has got a shell, which is the symbol of St. James of Compostela, hence the French word for scallops, coquille Saint-Jacques, shells of St. James. And he's got the pilgrims used to wear that shell on their tunics as a badge of the fact that they were pilgrims. So they are, as it were, figures from the past, but they're also stand-ins for us now, recognizing and trying to reimagine in our minds the miracle of the resurrection. Now, everywhere that you look in the painting, there's a shadow play that reveals the nature of the miracle. And this is very much consistent with Caravaggio's approach to depicting miracles, because, as I said before, he's militant in depicting a miracle as if it could have occurred in real life. So, for example, the most telling detail of all, perhaps, is that the fruit bowl in the foreground, which seems to teeter on the edge of the table, almost falling into our space. Well, that fruit bowl, which is a symbol, it's a symbol of the human being. It's a symbol of the soul as well. The apples have wormholes in them, so they symbolize the rot and the decay of flesh, but they are juxtaposed with grapes, and from grapes we make wine, and wine becomes the blood of Christ, which is our salvation. So the basket is a basket that contains both the inevitability of death and the possibility of salvation. And it's, so to speak, it's almost a Caravaggio's way of modeling in paint the fate of every human soul, to be caught between death and the possibility of salvation. And that's why the basket is on the very edge of the table. We can fall or we can rise to salvation. And whether we fall or rise to salvation will depend upon whether we recognize Christ, recognize him in our midst as here, or recognize him in our hearts. The bowl of fruit has cast a shadow which looks very much like a fish. And the fish was the ancient symbol of Christ. So to those with eyes to see the nature of the miracle, they will see that God has contrived a miraculously strange shadow in the shape of a fish, as it were, to indicate what it is that's going on. The painting, in terms of those who contemplate Christ, is divided into two groups, although one group is only represented by a single person. There are those who see, and there are those who don't see. Those who see are the two followers, arms outstretched, rising from his chair in amazement. The person who doesn't see is the innkeeper, whose head remains covered. If he knew that this was Jesus Christ, he would have taken his innkeeper's cap off. He's probably the chef of the meal. It's probably there. It's probably like a mini chef's cap. But he's not taking it off because he doesn't recognize Christ. He's just staring at him as if the main question in his mind is whether this guy, accompanied by these two poor pilgrims, is going to pay his bill. He's almost staring him out. But again, God has wrought in Caravaggio's shadow play another miracle, which is that the innkeeper's head casts a shadow on the wall behind Christ, which gives Christ a halo. So even he who doesn't recognize Christ is part of the divine machinery of light and shade, revealing Christ's own divinity. So this is where I come to Edward's question, which is whether in the act of recognition, Caravaggio has meant to imply the memory in the figure on the right, the memory in his mind of seeing Christ on the cross. So he's not only, as it were, expressing his amazement with a gesture which might almost be compared to that of a fisherman measuring the size of the fish that got away. He's not only measuring his amazement through space and through this wonderful foreshortened perspective, but he's also enacting the memory of the crucifixion that Christ has miraculously risen from. And likewise, this other poor pilgrim follower of Christ with his hole in his sleeve to indicate his humility, his lack of attachment to worldly things, his closeness to the spiritual truth that's above worldly things. It's very important, that hole in his arm. Likewise, he's rising up from the chair as if to reenact his own thought at this moment, which is, my God, literally, my God, you have risen. So, Edward, I think it's an absolutely terrific idea, and I think you're absolutely right. And I very much like the word often, which occurs twice in your question. You often go and see it. You've often thought, which suggests to me that you're someone who's got a true relationship with this painting. It's almost like, so I think of paintings in the National Gallery. Many paintings in the National Gallery that I go and see, I think of them almost as friends, or as friends. Yeah, I mean that I've seen them again and again, and I go especially to visit them. And it's one of the great enlightened policies. And you can't say that Britain is known for its enlightened cultural policies, but in this sense, it really is enlightened, that you don't have to pay to go into the National Gallery. And because you don't have to pay, you don't have to queue. And because the National Gallery is relatively small, you can just go in if you've got 10 minutes. You don't have to pay. You walk in and you find your friend and you look at your friend, in this case, Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, and you commune and you come to know the painting so much better. I read an amazing statistic which relates to this idea of relating to a particular picture, of befriending a picture and having your own thoughts about it, which was that because the National Gallery is free and you don't have to queue because you don't have to pay, the percentage of British visitors who visit the National Gallery who go more than once a year is very high. Whereas if you take the museum that I think is at the polar opposite, which would be the Louvre in Paris, which is far too large in the sense that it can take you half an hour, literally half an hour, to walk, because the Louvre is a mile long, to walk to the picture that you want to see. Not only does it take you half an hour to walk there, but unless you've gone to the trouble of getting yourself, to be a friend of the Louvre, and you can go in through the friend's entrance and not have to queue. Most French people, apparently, who visit the Louvre, a huge number of French people who visit the Louvre, only go once in their life. So this kind of relationship, that you're talking, it's so important. And I'm just going to, as it were, give Edward even more encouragement. I think, so you look at this picture, which is in the Chirazi Chapel, painted very much at the same time as the Supper at Emmaus. This shows the conversion of Paul/Saul, who was struck down from his horse on his way to kill Christians. He's converted to Christianity in this moment when light floods into his body. Divine insight is given to him, and he is experiencing at this time, this moment, the whole message of Christ, the whole life of Christ, from his infancy to the moment of his crucifixion. All of this is being, as it were, printed on his soul by the light of divine enlightenment. And so, in Caravaggio's brilliant invention, he lies as helpless as Christ had himself lain on the floor of the manger. So he is at this moment almost as if he's a baby in this moment of his vulnerability, having been struck from his horse, being converted. He's a baby, he's the infant Christ, but he's also reaching his arms up towards God, but also stretching them out in the gesture of crucifixion. He is also Christ at the moment of his death. He's experiencing the whole of Christ's life in one concentrated burst of illumination. So there's an exact parallel to this use of gesture to suggest crucifixion in this picture. And so, yeah, my answer to you is, well, it's two answers. Yes, I think you're dead right. And I think you're absolutely correct to read that in. One can never give Caravaggio too much credit for subtlety. He's an amazingly subtle painter. And point two, thank you for making me think about it. These Q&As, when we, that's that's not part of the talk. These Q&As, when we conceived them, they were meant to be short, sharp, and sweet. That's what Kate's instruction to me was: don't, just give a fairly short answer. But it's such an interesting and good question that I've gone on and on. Anyway, keep rolling the questions in, and whenever I can, I will answer them. I can't promise to answer every question every week, but anyway, that's the start. That's the first entry in our Q&A section, and there'll be more to come. Thank you for joining me.